Thank you so much for coming back. We appreciate it. It's hard to imagine a better set of talks than the morning, but I can promise you that it's going to be great. So panel 2 is it's called Participatory Mapping in Social Practice, Art, and Design. I'm Susan Smellion. I'm director of the Center for Public Humanities at Brown. We're sponsoring the conference, and my job now is to introduce the speakers, and then I'll let them come up. I'll introduce everybody at once, and then at the end we'll have some time and we'll come up and take questions. Marissa, are there any announcements? No, we're all set. I love that. Okay. So first speaker will be Rosten Wu. Rosten is the hardest working man in show business. I think he gave 3 or 4 talks, maybe 5 talks yesterday all over Providence when people found he was in town, insisted he come and speak to their group. And when he isn't speaking at Brown and RISD, he's an artist, designer, and writer. He collaborates and consults with grassroots organizations, including Little Tokyo Service Center, the Black Workers Center, the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, and Esperanza Community Housing Corporation, as well as the City of Los Angeles and the California State Parks. His work has been exhibited at the Cooper Hewitt Design Triennial, the Venice Architecture Biennale, and various peers, public housing developments, shopping malls, and parks. He is co-founder and former executive director of the Center for Urban Pedagogy and winner of the 2016 National Design Award for Institutional Achievement. His book, Street Value, about race and retail urban development, was published by Princeton Architectural Press. Lize Mogel is an interdisciplinary artist and counter-cartographer. She has mapped public parks in Los Angeles, future territorial disputes in the Arctic, and wastewater economies in New York City. Her work has been exhibited in the UAE, South Korea, the Pittsburgh Biennials, and Greater New York at PS1. She spoke at the 2013 Creative Time Summit and has been an artist in residence at the Headland Center for the Arts and the New York City Urban Field Station. Currently, she is a current Lower Manhattan Cultural Center Governor's Island artist in residence. She is co-editor of the book Map Collection and Atlas of Radical Cartography, a project that significantly influenced the conversation and production around mapping and activism. Our next 2 speakers have been artists in residence, for which we'd like to thank the Brown Arts Initiative. Their exhibit that they did by being at many, even more events than Rosten, all over Providence in the last week, where they had community members make maps. Those are exhibited at the Center for Public Humanities at 357 Benefit Street in an exhibit called Map It Out. And you should come down and visit 9 to 5 any day. Gwen MacGregor is a visual artist and geographer working across the disciplines of installation, video, photography, and geographic scholarship. She has artworks in collections such as the Art Gallery of Ontario, Oakville Galleries, and the Royal Bank Collection. She has also participated in numerous international art residencies, including the International Studio Curatorial Program in New York, and she holds a Toronto Friends of the Visual Arts Award. Gwen is a Ph.D. candidate in geography at the University of Toronto, which for me is the most moving of her accomplishments. And an article of her geographic scholarship on the Canadian-USA border on the Great Lakes is forthcoming in the cross-disciplinary journal Intermedialite. How'd they do? Okay. Now comes the hard part. Sandra Rechico. How'd they do? Rechico. Sandra, stand up and say your name, would you? Just how it's spelled, Rechico. Sandra Rechico, thank you. Has long maintained a studio practice in drawing, photography, installation, and object making, where she regularly looks at maps, routing, wayfaring, navigation, and distance. She is also interested in the residue and detritus from walks and their representation. She has been the co-curator of Wade, a series of temporary public art projects that took place in Toronto's wading pools. She is an associate professor at the University of Guelph, where she coordinates the MFA program in studio art. Elisa? Okay. Elisa Hamilton is a socially engaged multimedia artist who creates inclusive artworks emphasizing shared spaces and the hopeful examination of our everyday places, objects, and experiences. She has been the recipient of 4 public art grants to create temporary public works in Boston's Fort Point neighborhood and a Creative City grant from the New England Foundation for the Arts. Projects include Sound Lab, a community sound project that was featured in Listen Here, The Art of Sound at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, Community Legacy, a collaboration with the MIT List Visual Arts Center, Slideshow, co-presented by Hub Week and Now Plus There in Boston, and Pack Our Bags, an interactive installation recently exhibited by For Freedoms at the International Center of Photography. Hamilton's current project is Jukebox, a community-centered public art project at the Cambridge Foundry. Now I don't have to say anybody's name for maybe another hour, and so I'm feeling good about this. Rosten, you're up.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This has been an incredible day for me already. Even if this totally bombs, I learned so much from the first couple of panels that it's a totally worthwhile trip for me. So it's been truly incredible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about maps and participation through a few projects that I've done, and I tried to kind of select a few projects I think have maybe some kind of resonance, particularly with Shannon's keynote. So I'm an artist and designer primarily. I make diagrams, typically diagrams of how power operates and how people situate themselves into larger social systems. And I came to graphic design from political theory. This is maybe the most famous piece of artwork related to political theory. It's the frontispiece to Leviathan. And so it has like a really literal kind of illustration of that idea. It's like pretty much all that. The frontispiece, like the first image in the book Leviathan. And essentially you have this idea. Can people hear me? Do I need to like really lean into this thing to be heard? Okay, I will do that. Okay. So this is the frontispiece to Leviathan, and you can sort of see in this image, it kind of contains the whole book. You have this idea that you have this sovereign, and then all of the people are what gives that sovereign power, right? Those are the people who you can kind of make out as the backs of their heads kind of facing away from you. Okay, all right. And I got this sort of image juxtaposition from Danielle Allen, a kind of political theorist, classicist. So this is the rough draft that is never published of the frontispiece. And you can sort of see those same faces, but instead they're turned outwards. So you can sort of identify there's actually an individual there. They're not just sort of this become like they haven't given up their identity to become part of the sovereign or just invest the sovereign with power, but they actually also have their own relationship to that larger body politic. And that's sort of a kind of idea that I think about when I'm trying to make my work is how do you sort of create this larger portrait of power, but also include an individual in it, and what's their relationship to it? How do they move and act? So this first project I'm going to show you is not a participatory map in like the way that you kind of might traditionally imagine, like, oh, a participatory map involves people like putting their stuff on or drawing it. But I want to sort of talk about a map as a tool of participation. So this is a project that came to me when I was at the Center for Urban Pedagogy. I was brought there from a longshore worker and sort of union salter named Tony Pearlstein. And he'd been trying to organize across locals, so convince people who were working in the port of Newark that they needed to like talk to people who worked in the port of Baltimore or in the port of Long Beach. And it was very hard to convince people why they should spend their very limited hours doing any kind of union-related work, doing these kind of very distant collaborations when most of the organizing always happens at this local level. And so he was just obsessed with this idea. It was sort of like, I think of it as like in like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where like Richard Dreyfuss is like making the mountain out of mashed potatoes. He's just obsessed with this idea. And he had these maps all over his bedroom where he was making with string and dots. And he's sort of like, I need to figure out a way to kind of organize people and convince people of doing this project. So we ended up working with assembling an amazing team that included Bill Rankin, the cartographer, a labor journalism group called Labor Notes, a design office called Thumb, and made this project called the Cargo Chain. And basically what it is a map of the cargo chain. It takes you through a sort of journey about the history of global shipping. It's a very small side note. As labor power in the manufacturing sector in America has sort of declined, labor power in the transportation sector has increased, right? Because we have this very different economic system instead of just-in-case production where you have this like warehouses of stuff that's being made in the US in case someone wants to buy it, you have fast fashion or things that are produced at a very small, a very short timetable and brought very quickly. So if your PlayStations don't arrive by Christmas, it becomes a huge problem. So the ability to do like a work stoppage or something like that, you actually have quite a bit of leverage as someone who works in this transportation chain. So this map sort of tells that story and that shift in power. And then it talks about the journey of, in this case, an iPod being made in China as it travels to a freight center, to a long-haul shipper, to a harbor pilot, onto a train, to a warehouse worker, and all the logistics that go in. And on the left side, there's a list of all sort of the corporations involved in that work. And on the right side, a list of all the sort of the labor organizing that's involved on the right side. So you have like a very quick index of that entire process. And then it opens up to a map that shows basically, as the title says, choke points in a fragile network, showing these circles are scaled to the amount of cargo that enters into that port. And then you have the various kinds of intermodal nodes where a piece of cargo might move from a boat to a train, or to a train to a truck, and so on and so forth. And then dotted with some stories about successful labor strikes in the 20th century by transportation workers. And so, it's a map, very straightforward map that you might see in a book, but it's designed to be a tool, and specifically as an organizing tool that's used in a lot of conversations to convince people to work together in an intermodal network. So this is sort of an example of what I would sort of say, like seeing as a corporation. Like really what Tony wanted to be able to do was have the workers who are involved in the system be able to see this intermodal transportation system in the same way that their employers did. With the idea that there's a lot of power in being able to understand that as a network. So if you have a work stoppage in Newark, maybe that's not very important because you can just reroute the cargo to Baltimore. And being able to understand those relationships and see this kind of larger network can really change the way you develop your organizing strategy. So this is just a very simple example of a straightforward map that, in my sense, my idea is that it actually changes the way that participation works in that labor market. And so part of this project was, printing an edition of 10,000 and distributing them throughout ports in North America. I'm going to switch gears completely to show, I'm basically going to show 4 really different kinds of participation. To a project that I did a few years ago in Los Angeles, where I live now. And so this is a project that was commissioned by the Los Angeles County Arts Commission to do essentially what they were calling, I think, like a creative visioning toolkit. So you can imagine like that phrase, like it's part of this kind of larger project of what I sort of call like jokingly the creative placemaking industrial complex. So there's all this kind of like funding and resources now presently out there for like, how do we get artists involved in some way with places and in a planning process, and we'll just like, it almost felt like a gold rush kind of thing at one point of like, just like anybody who has any kind of project or wants to be involved, we have tons of money to do it, and we'll figure out like what it means and why we're doing it later on. And so this was a project that was kind of in that world. And I think it has a particular relationship to the things that Sharon was talking about. So this neighborhood, Willowbrook, it's a part of unincorporated Los Angeles County. It's between Watts and Compton. And I'm guessing that most of you are not familiar with Willowbrook, but you know Watts and Compton. And the reason you know Watts and Compton is because there is a plethora of media representations of that neighborhood. So I can give this presentation in other countries, and everyone's like, oh yeah, Watts and Compton, I know. And what they know, that idea of what Watts and Compton is, I think scales in telescopes down into the county. So like what someone in Germany thinks Watts and Compton is not that different than what someone who works for LA County but hasn't been to Watts or Compton thinks Watts and Compton is. And so it's a very particular problem in my mind of how that image changes the way people think about like what does this neighborhood need, or how do we activate participation in this neighborhood if we're doing planning. So that neighborhood, Willowbrook, was getting a huge capital investment from the reopening of a hospital and the redevelopment of a metro station, and they wanted to have creative visioning from the residents to figure out how to spend that money ostensibly. And so I was asked to sort of work on that. I agreed. And very quickly, kind of regretted it, right? And I'll sort of explain why if it's not obvious. So this is a document that I found shortly after starting the project. It's a plan for Watts, And it starts out like this. Let's be honest, the last thing the residents of Watts want to see or read about is another plan for this nationally known community. Plans and studies have a way of wearing thin over the years, and this brochure is the summary of still another plan. So you'll notice that if you continue reading, there's no but, this is going to be different, or we're doing something, that's it, like full stop. They're just like, here's another plan. And so that was in 1974. And then, in fact, doing a little more research, Gensler had produced a plan for Willowbrook the year before I was asked to do a creative placemaking exercise in this neighborhood. So the people who lived in Willowbrook were understandably totally jaded and tired of being asked to vision the future of their neighborhood by a bunch of people who did not live there. And so, this kind of like visioning exercise that typically is kind of organized around some of the techniques that Sharon is sort of describing, standard planning charrette stuff where you're putting Post-it notes on various things and saying, oh, do you want parks or housing? And people are like, oh, we want parks and housing, and then you just kind of synthesize your way up till you have like whatever you want to say. So this kind of, they had this whole plan that was organized around a wellness complex, and they built this undulating bike path that would require taking out 1 out of every 10 houses. So just like these ideas, and this is sort of their pro bono project of like, here, we're doing this for this neighborhood. So it just became very quickly a kind of a very depressing prospect of like, why am I here? What am I doing here? What is valuable to do in this situation? And so I kind of figured it, there's a sort of a long period of kind of wilderness type wandering. I have, it's an unusual situation for me to have a lot of resources, but like kind of no constituency or no person that I'm really trying to make the project for. So it took a long time to figure out what the project could be. And so I tried to create some kind of guardrails for it. One was whatever I did had to be somehow useful or beneficial to someone who lived in Willowbrook within the boundaries of the time that I had to do the project. Very simple guide rail, but a lot of these planning things, all of the value of it is predicated on some future that is absolutely unfunded and imaginary. And so then the other thing, I was just listening to this song called No More Fiction all the time, and then at one point I was like, oh right, no more fiction. Like that's the mantra for this project. Like there's just so much work done about this neighborhood, about what it could be, or an imaginary kind of idea of what it is. Like what if I just tried to do something that was really documentary as this visioning exercise? So in a way, kind of trying to reverse the optic of instead of having residents try to envision what their future might be, what if it was just something that helped the county see what was already there? So I ended up producing this project called Willowbrook Is. It was essentially a home, garden, and vehicle tour. And this is something when I proposed it to the county, they were like, oh, we actually organize home and garden tours all over our district, but we've never thought to do that in Willowbrook. And so we're like, that's that's interesting. Why? But they were really receptive to the idea that like, oh, there might be something interesting to see there. So essentially, it was an all-day festival. A literal home and garden tour, and then there's sort of a publication that came out of that called Willowbrook Is. And so when you spend that time to sort of see what is in the neighborhood, and sort of this is like, I think very common, what I call sort of drive-by urbanism, like you drive down the street and then you produce your idea of what a place is based on what you can see from your car window and what photographs you can take while you're driving through. And of course, what you see is just sort of your own preconceptions reflected back to you in some way. And this is very particularly true in a place like Willowbrook, where, this is, I don't know, it's probably true in most places, but Willowbrook happens to have really deep lots. So whatever you see from the lot line is totally different than what's going on in the backyard. So people have like a pretty small pedestrian-looking house, and in the back they've got like chickens and horses and a pond, and like just like crazy stuff is going on back there. And people have really developed these amazing kind of personal kind of paradises. So did this documentation of these places and people and stories. So people who made like kind of amazing gardens or had really incredible interiors. This is a couple that had, Sandy had an exotic turtle collection and Harry had an exotic cactus collection, and they met and fell in love and then built this kind of like cactus turtle world in their backyard. This is a butcher who is a self-taught kind of stonemason, built this fountain out of the rubble from the construction of the 105 freeway. This is like an amazing this Centennial Marching Band led by the former arranger for Barry White. This is an all-volunteer dog training club that's run by 2 retired truck drivers. They meet every Saturday and then have this whole kind of wild kind of obstacle course that they have the dogs go through. This is a retired social worker that has a model train obsession. The sculptor Charles Dixon, incredible artist, but also has the world's largest collection of super soakers. And the super soaker is actually invented by a black aerospace engineer from Leimert Park, so it has a kind of particular kind of like neighborhood tie-in. And then all these different kinds of car clubs. So the guy on the right, he's the son of a guy who was the mechanic of Herbie the Love Bug. And so they have this kind of amazing collection of beetles. And then this is a guy who runs a horse and buggy service out of his backyard. Takes people around on like prom night and things like that. Youth equestrian societies. The Tomorrow's Aeronautical Museum has all these world records for youngest people in airspace. So just things that are like pretty amazing and surprising that are not sort of part of the vision that a county has, like, oh, well, we're working in like South LA, like, what do those people need? Is sort of like, I think, like a very natural kind of like impulse for someone who works for the county and doesn't have any real relationships there. And so this book was, again, printed in an edition of 10,000. Half of the copies are sold as a fundraiser for the Willowbrook Library, and the other half are given to anyone who works at the county level, anyone who works like at Metro, who's assigned to do projects in Willowbrook. So it's kind of designed almost as kind of an alternate orientation manual. Along with like your SPA statistics, you also get this book of like stories, some of which are like, uplifting, and some of which are just kind of weird. Like there's a guy who like raises wolves in his backyard. That's not necessarily a good thing, but it's pretty interesting. So the idea there is just to kind of create an image of a place that is hard to assimilate into like an existing narrative of like, oh, I know what Watts or Willowbrook is. And that was that project. So that's sort of an example of, I guess, a way of trying to leverage participation into a planning process. It's an exercise in a way of kind of refusing to produce the map. So now I want to talk about something very different in a different, a little bit, I think just after that project, I was asked by Esri, Environmental Systems Research Institute, to design an interface for them. If anyone are familiar with Esri, they make GIS, they sort of create a GIS. And so they're sort of, for people who are not familiar, I think of them as like the Microsoft of mapping, like insofar as that they are like totally pervasive, massive, the oldest people in the game, and also kind of like widely hated, and everyone thinks that like their interface is terrible, and they're a little bit like the dinosaur in the room, but still kind of like have total hegemony over like most municipal or like corporate mapping platforms. So anyway, they for some reason thought I would be good at designing an interface for them. They wanted to make a simpler interface for ostensibly community groups, but I have my doubts about that, for accessing their data sets. And so that was, I'm not really going to talk about that project, but instead sort of some of the things that I learned from that experience. And so this is, I don't know if people are familiar with Tapestry Segmentation, this product that they make, but it's like it's a major kind of, it's like one of their major profit centers. And Tapestry Segmentation is essentially a way of thinking about the world by grouping all people into 100 categories. And so there's like sort of like these things that they call life modes. So those life modes are kind of like the bigger categories. So examples of that are here, like they all have slightly offensive names, from high society to metropolis, solo acts, traditional living, American quilt, and then they have sort of subcategories. So social security set, inner city tenants, rural bypass, midlife junction, top rung. And so everyone here in this world is part of one of these 100 life modes. And so there's a big emphasis at a place like Esri on what they call actionable data. So that's sort of like, we need to produce data or a map that will allow someone to make a specific decision. Like, where am I going to open a Starbucks? Where am I going to close a Petco? Or whatever it might be. It's designed to kind of create the world. So you can sort of imagine there's sort of this kind of problem of the perpetual motion machine of this form of abstraction and then de-abstraction, right? So like, you have this idea that the world is made up of 100 people, and then you map it out, and you use that to figure out where to place physical things in that world. And you kind of, then you can imagine, well, then the world becomes kind of more and more like this imaginary 100 people world. So you have this kind of never-ending world of segmentation that starts to kind of be set in effect. And the metaphor of Microsoft goes even through this, right? Is that like, this is like the crudest kind of like technology for doing this kind of thing, like the sort of things that are being done at like a Silicon Valley type tech company to segment and market people are even more sophisticated and complex and impenetrable, right? And so, and one thing I should note is that this, the Tapestry software is a completely proprietary system. Like, you'll never be able to figure out what makes you an L1 or an L2 or whatever it is, right? It's an opaque form of indexing. So set that aside for a moment, and then talk about a very simple paper project I made. So I guess I'll stop there. Well, okay. So a few years ago, I was asked to work on a project, a group exhibition called Organize Your Own. And the prompt for this was Stokely Carmichael. Sort of, there's a famous exchange where like a white person's like, well, what can white people do to help? And Stokely Carmichael's like, don't help us, like organize your own people. And so the prompt is sort of thinking about what does self-determination, self-organizing look like today, and what does that mean for people to try to organize, as opposed to sort of thinking of themselves as allies, but how do you organize within your own group, whatever that is. So I sort of took that prompt to be like, maybe I could create a space for reflection about the way we are sort of organized and how we kind of form an identity. So it's a very simple project. It's like a big grid, and it asks you to do three things. Like, first, place a pin in a category that describes you, and second, put a different color pin in one of the three categories that most you think define your fate in life. And third, put a pin in a category that you would be willing to organize around, like where you think there's affinity for organizing in your life. And all the categories are taken from the American Community Survey, so things like race and marital status and means of transportation, a National Health Institute survey, which of the following best represents yourself, your sexuality, what do you mean by something else if you don't see yourself in one of the 6 categories that they start there, how long have you lived in your neighborhood? And then lastly, a survey of the American consumer mind, which is sort of like a very popular marketing demographic survey. So questions about like your income and what car you drive, but also general attitudes, things like, I enjoy showing off my home to guests, or I feel really good about seeing celebrities in the media that share my ethnic background. I like to learn about foreign cultures. So these different ideas of like the way that people are using this to segment ourselves. So you can imagine it starts blank, and then over time, people fill it in. And so the idea of it is to kind of give people a moment of reflection to think about these categories that are sort of determining all these things about their world, like the way that they are being segmented through these formal aspects of categorization, which is almost like a necessary step in mapping any kind of data, right? So there's a presentation in the last panel about sort of kind of creating this index and categorizing these 5 different kinds of white supremacist organization structures, right? So that same kind of logic that's kind of originated in maybe a qualitative sociology department is certainly applied in the development of all these indices in corporate America and also in governance. So then, it's both a personal reflection, but then over time, you kind of get a portrait of like, who's coming to this exhibit and what are they thinking about who they are as an individual. So it becomes, over time, ideally, a group portrait. And sort of the ideas that were informing this, I'm really interested in the work of a historian named Matthew Hanna, who talks about the concept of statistical citizenship. Basic idea being that how you fill out the census might have more effect on how your government works for you than voting. All these ideas about representation and how much funding you get and which kind of funding you get and whether materials are produced in your language or not kind of can come down to this sort of your willingness to be entered into this database. So a lot of students, when they were filling this out, I got this toured a bunch of universities and I would get these angry emails from students being like, why do you use these categories? Like, this isn't a good representation. I don't think of my sexuality as any of these things. And it's like, well, you might not care about those categories, but those categories care about you, and like they're there, and like that's always being collected. So how you participate in these things kind of matters. And so that's sort of a thought about how we participate in mapping all the time, whether or not we're intending to participate or not. Last project, I'll be brief. I think I'm probably at time or close. 3 minutes. Okay, I can do it in 3. All right. This is PowerPoints. I was asked by another artist organization to make a map of power in Los Angeles. Immediately, I was like, that's impossible. It doesn't make any sense. But I thought it would be an interesting opportunity to kind of disseminate a methodology that was created by an organization called SCOPE, Strategic Concepts in Organizing and Political Education. It was founded in the early mid-90s by a guy named Anthony Thigpen, who was a former Black Panther. And he was really influenced, I'll skip through these, by social psychologist Kurt Lewin and the art of war. And so he developed this idea of like, if you're trying to think about how change works, there's a sort of a classic analysis of force field, like there's these two forces, it's like a one axis kind of thing, like opposing and driving forces. And that sort of helps, in trying to think about an individual, but it gets increasingly complicated as you think about groups, right? So then you have a whole bunch of organizations. So opposition groups, your organization, allies, so on and so forth. And what if you have more than one decision maker, right? So then that starts to break down. And so he basically created this form of mapping out power relationships, which requires a couple of steps. Like one is to kind of create an agenda. So in the upper left corner, you can sort of see this is a sample agenda of like wanting to create a workforce development training fund, let's say. Then you can map from left to right people who are, how strongly people agree with you on that, and including yourself, and then how strongly people are opposed in it, and then up, bottom to top, sort of whether you're, your level of power, whether you're like a fundamental decision maker or whether you're not on the radar. And it's meant to be something that you do not just once, but over time in a campaign, and also kind of over year after year as you're developing power in your organization. And I kind of made that specifically as a kind of a corrective to what I sort of think are like really standard left political art maps of power, which I think can be really wonderful, but they often sort of are about creating a network diagram of sort of like a distant other that is like interlocking board directorates, or like here's how Teapot Dome scandal worked, and they're sort of valorized like these are amazing, you can see how everything works. But if you're really trying to change things, you actually have to also put yourself on that map and sort of imagine, what is your relationship to power? How could you change that relationship? What do you have to do to move up in this thing? Who do you have to move more to your side? Who's a target that you can actually work with to organize? So I think this is sort of a very useful, technique of participatory mapping. It's usually done in a large room with a lot of people, and becomes a standard reference point that people can talk about, so they build a shared agenda of like, well, what do we have to do in this campaign? And I think it's a really valuable technique. So that's the last thing I wanted to present. Again, it's not my work. I just sort of tried to design a way to disseminate it. It's produced by an organization called Scope. Thanks so much.
So while we're setting up, just a fun fact is that I used to work for Rosten at the Center for Urban Pedagogy. I call him my boss friend. So it's nice to be after him on a panel. So, and also I use the power mapping brochure in my class every year. It's a really amazing teaching tool if you're teaching students doing any kind of planning or organizing or anything like that. So there's a plug for it.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, that's like down at the bottom somewhere. There we go. All right. So thank you to Marissa and to Susan. I'm really excited to be here and also to be participating in this conference with so many amazing speakers and projects. And I'm going to try to figure out where to put my water so I don't spill it on something electronic. I'll just put it next to all the electronic stuff. And let's see if I can see this. So for more than 20 years, I've been working as an artist, a designer, an advocate, and an educator. And much of my work revolves around maps and mapping. So I make maps, I write about maps, I've curated exhibitions about maps. I'm trained as an artist, but I call myself a counter-cartographer, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. Nope, not yet. In his 1989 essay, Deconstructing the Map, geographer Brian Harley describes maps as part of the intellectual apparatus of power that help create myths that would assist in the maintenance of the territorial status quo. So Harley was one of the first academic geographers to really theorize a critical cartography, which honed in on the inherent political nature of maps. Maps which until that point had been widely considered to visualize objective scientific truths. Haha, right? Harley's work, among others, was crucial to the contemporary practice of counter-cartography. And I like this definition of counter-cartography from the activist graphic designer John Emerson: producing maps that challenge the dominant mainstream narrative of a site or history, often from an explicitly political or activist perspective, or from the point of view of historically marginalized communities. So counter-cartography recognizes the power of and function of conventional maps, so to inform, to guide, to locate, to give voice to claim, to territorialize, but counter-cartography subverts these functions for specifically political means. So if historic uses of the map are to demarcate territory, execute battle plans, or inscribe a canonical history onto a place, then the counter-map's function is to challenge territorial norms, support and represent social movements, and bring hidden histories to the surface. And so for me, counter-cartography makes the politics of place visible, and it brings spatial justice issues to the surface. And I've built my career on making maps that are mappy, that represent a place, a situation, or a social issue. And sometimes these maps are made with participation from the community that they are then distributed back to. And these projects have circulated in public spaces and in art spaces. But in the past couple of years, I've really become more interested in creating a more embodied cartography. So as a strategy for engaging people in the politics of place firsthand. And I've been really interested in urban infrastructure also for the past couple of years, especially in water infrastructure at both ends of the system, drinking water and wastewater. And so I've been working on these issues in New York City, which is where I live. This slide is part of an earlier project called the Sludge Economy. And so this is a chocolate cake, of course, because we're talking about waste, iced with New York City's official map of sewer sheds. And it was served at a public talk in a park, which is on top of a wastewater treatment plant in New York City. And so participants would eat their infrastructure, and they were literally embody it, right? And so that implicates them in their role as both producers of waste and also consumers of not just cake, but public infrastructure services like wastewater treatment. So since 2016, I've been working on a long-term project about New York City's drinking water infrastructure, and this project is called Walking the Watershed, and that's kind of an overarching title for a number of projects within it. And this project critically explores the relationship between New York City and the mostly rural communities that supply the city's water. So much of the physical and policy infrastructure of the water system is completely invisible to city residents. New Yorkers do not really, for the most part, know where their water comes from. How many people in Providence know where their water comes from? Quick show of hands. How many people live in Providence? Okay, so not very many of you know where your water comes from. Awesome, this proves my point perfectly. So the infrastructure is invisible, but it has major impacts on the local communities in which the drinking water originates and is managed. So it's an extractive relationship. Walking the Watershed brings the social, economic, political, and ethical questions around this infrastructure to the surface through a series of experiential and participatory projects. And so about 90% of New York City's water comes from a mountainous region called the Catskills, which is about 150 miles north of the city. And this is a place that was completely remade over the last 100 years, geographically and economically, by New York City water infrastructure and its related policy. So I've spent the last 4 years learning about the relationship between New York City and the Catskills. So this includes spending a lot of time in the Catskills, talking to people, building relationships with them, building relationships with organizations, field research, driving around and looking at things, spending time, and then just being on the land and being on the water. So before I get to, and this is the Catskills from a zoomed out view. Thank you, Google Earth. So before I get into describing the project, I actually need to take about 5 minutes to give you the backstory of the water system. Context is very important. So John Wesley Powell, who was the director of the U.S. Geological Survey in the late 1880s, defines a watershed as that area of land, a bounded hydrologic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common watercourse, and where, as humans settled, simple logic demanded that they become part of a community. So a watershed or a water system is a community. It interconnects the living things within it, and it produces a community or a public by nature of its geography, but also by law. So the New York City watershed is shaped and processed by infrastructure. It's controlled by environmental policy and land use regulation. And because watersheds, water systems, and water bodies they can be very vast and tentacular, my favorite word of the moment, these publics can also be expansive in definition. So the New York City watershed connects geographically and culturally distinct communities, the urban and the rural, the relationship between which I would call it's complicated. And it's also negotiated through agreements, regulation, legislation, and quite a lot of lawsuits. This relationship is contradictory. It's both symbiotic and it's parasitic. And because of it, the water system can be both hegemonic and it can be a commons. So the Catskills is the largest part of the New York City water system. Like I said, it provides 90% of the water. The other 10% comes from the Croton system, which is across the Hudson River and south in suburban Westchester. And so the system as a whole provides about 1 billion gallons of water per day to about 9.5 million people. So it's really a massive system. And the Catskill system itself, which you see here, has 6 large reservoirs and 2 90-mile-long underground aqueducts that bring water to New York City. And the Catskills is why New York City has what's called the champagne of drinking water, which is why our pizza and bagels are supposedly so good. But this champagne comes at a price to Catskills communities. So the early history of the water supply is an imperialist one. The Catskills system was constructed from 1905 to 1965, and during that time, New York City used eminent domain to acquire land, homes, farms, businesses, and entire villages, which they submerged under the 6 reservoirs. The city could seize land with as little as 30 days' notice. They would give the owner a partial payment up front, and then they would negotiate for the rest. And during these negotiations, which could drag on for years, the city really tried its very best to undervalue property. So 22 communities and about 5,000 people were displaced in the rural Catskills in this time. And these were people who had been living on the land for generations, and they had a deep attachment to it and obviously to their communities. And so generations later, there's still residual bitterness and resentment towards the city for this. And this painting by local artist Kirsten Wyckoff called Where Have All the People Gone kind of sums it up. So this is a depiction of the town of Gilboa underneath the Schoharie Reservoir. So you can see the town down there. This is the Gilboa Dam. And then up in the clouds, you see like the sort of ancestors with the Jesus light, shining down. So I think that really, it does sum up the feeling. This image and anything that doesn't have a credit on it as part of my research, my own research. This image was taken in 2016, which was a very dry year, and the reservoirs in the Catskills were at record lows. And so in certain places, you could actually see the remnants of some of the town. So this is a house foundation from the town of Arena, which was demolished in the 1950s to construct the Acton Reservoir. And so to take this picture, I'm really standing in the middle of the reservoir, but the water was so low that you could actually see some things. The former towns are memorialized by these ubiquitous brown signs that are placed around all of the reservoirs. But in the late 1980s, everything changed because of a little something called the Clean Water Act. So cities would now need to filter their drinking water unless they can control pollution at the source. A filtration plant would cost New York City billions. It wasn't doing so good economically in the 80s, 70s and 80s, and it would really be more cost effective even in the long run to prevent pollution upstream. So the Catskills had some leverage, and because the city needed them to cooperate in order to do this. And so for the first time, the Catskills towns organized together, and they presented a unified front, and they entered into 2 years of extremely difficult negotiations with New York City, New York State, and environmental groups. And what's really important and kind of amazing about these negotiations is that the sides had extremely oppositional viewpoints, and they also had some long-held biases about each other. I mean, think about like the general stereotypes between cityites, right, and country folk. So, and there you have it. But they got together week after week, and they hashed it out, and eventually they came to a compromise. Now, imagine that happening on a federal level right now, right? Just imagine that. So while the final agreement didn't please everyone, it really recognized that there needed to be an exchange, that the Catskills would adhere to city regulation, and the city would pay them to do it. And that's pretty much what happened. So the city now provides funding for economic development, for wastewater treatment, and helps with flood control planning, among other things. And then a lot of the 174,000 acres of land and water the city owns in the Catskills is now open to the public for boating, fishing, hiking, and hunting. And these are ubiquitous blue signs that are all over the watershed, and these demarcate the boundaries of city-owned land and tell you what you can and can't do on that land. And so you need permits, free permits, but still you need permits to use some of this land. The flip side is that city policies keep the economy in the Catskills small. Because they have to restrict what enters the water supply, like waste. There are really strong limits on important things like development, what type of business you can have, and farming. And so the Catskills then relies on tourism for their economy. And that's the backstory. Thanks for your patience. So back to walking the watershed. I want to relate it first to psychogeography. And I don't know if people know what this means in the room. So practiced by the Situationists, which was a sort of, I would say, political art group operating in Europe in the 1960s. And they used experimental methods to understand how the geography of the city was produced and what its effects were on inhabitants. So I would call walking the watershed an exercise in psychohydrogeography, revealing through experimental methods how urban forces shape the rural environment in the watershed. And so one of the most well-known situationist techniques is the derive. And the derive is an exercise done in small groups, letting the built environment direct your way. The derive is also known as the drift, so that the drifter becomes aware of the forces of architecture, of capitalism, of social relations that shape your experience of that space. So in drifting through the watershed, the forces that underpin it are actually revealed very slowly. The longer you stay in the landscape, and I'm talking about years here, the more you understand how much of a manipulated environment it is. So many aspects of the watershed are impacted or controlled by New York City, from measurable things like water flow and temperature in certain streams to invisible things like a town's tax base. So to really understand the forces shaping the New York City watershed, you need a guide. You need a tour guide. So I use the form of the guided tour or the critical tour as a way to create a more embodied geography and to tease out multiple complex narratives of a place. A tour is a way of activating the map or performing the map. The artist Sarah Knaus writes about the tour as an art form. Critical tours are explorations of the discursivity of site explored in situ. They are simultaneously in the landscape while exploring knowledge that may appear out of place, in the sense of complicating and denaturalizing the place. Connections between concepts, images, histories, and places are produced through bodily movement, and the insight metaphorically invoked as a change in perspective is on the tour both physical and perceptual. And then she goes on to quote the artist Ryan Griffiths, who says, "Tours are a narrative form that is structured by a spatial experience." And I really love what Jeff Ward said just in the panel before about turning the tour bus into a site of conscience. That really spoke to me. So this past summer, I launched the tour project Views from the Watershed. And the pilot project, for the pilot project, I led 2 tours, guided bus tours of the New York City water system in the Catskills. And so one goal of this project is to use the very thing that keeps the Catskills economy small and relying on tourism, which is water management, and instead create water supply tourism. And so water supply tourism complicates the conventional touristic idea of the Catskills, which is known for its mountain recreation, quaint towns, cute shops, vegetable-themed festivals, nice views, that sort of thing. And so the tours focus on the social and political conditions under which New York City's water gets to residents. In a region where government, so both New York City and New York State, produces the dominant narrative of the place, these tours put forward a very different public imaginary that elevates local voices. And so let me take you on a tour of the tour really quickly. Oops. Oh, yeah, that's right. So the tour route travels from the Ashokan Reservoir to the Papacton Reservoir and back again, and we cover a lot of ground. We visit 2 distinct watersheds, 2 of the largest reservoirs in the system, 3 tributary streams, and 1 cemetery, and some other stuff in between. We cover about 110 miles, and the tour takes 6 hours. That's not that long, come on. And so the tour is called Views from the Watershed because it's based around hearing firsthand from different local stakeholders and experts to give people really the full picture of how complicated the relationship is between the city and the Catskills. And so we hear from Adam, who is the Director of Public Relations for the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, the DEP, which is the city agency that manages the water system. And he is an enthusiastic champion of the water system. He also has incredible knowledge of its history, its operation, all of the details. And here we are on a public walking path by the Ashokan Reservoir. Not pictured is Diane, who's an historian who wrote the book on water supply history. And also for 20 years, she worked for the liaison organization between the city and the Catskills. So she has this, and she's from the Catskills. So there's a really interesting kind of position. And she talks about the difficult negotiation leading up to the agreement between the city and the Catskills towns. This is Wendell, who is the executive director of the Catskills Mountain Club, which is a conservation group that advocates for increased recreational use of city-owned land. And they collaborate with the DEP to build trails on that land, which apparently is quite a process. And here we are at a public boat launch on the Acton Reservoir. Then we go to the Acton Cemetery, which is up above the Acton Reservoir, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And we talked to Marianne, who's a historian and a gravestone restorer, and has a great T-shirt which says, "Every family has a dirty gravestone," something like that. So this cemetery is where the city moved all of the unclaimed graves from the towns that were displaced from the Acton, by the Acton and the Ashokan, because all of, not only the houses moved and the farms and every kind of organic structure, trees, bushes, but also grave sites had to be moved. And so it's a really resonant site. And Marianne has really deeply researched all of the people and families buried there, and so she really was able to connect us to that history. And then the last stop is at the Stony Clove Creek, and we hear about stream management to control erosion and flooding, because Catskills towns have historically experienced major flooding, but that's going to get worse in the future as there are more rain events and more severe storms because of climate change. So that's very much on everybody's minds. So that's the tour. One of the other things that I'm working on is to expand the representations of the watershed, the visual representations of it. So, you know, it's a very large and complex system. It's very hard to represent. And this is the kind of the only and the best visualization there is. This is the city's official map of the water supply system. And, you know, it shows the scale and the geography of the infrastructure, but it doesn't really tell us much about how the infrastructure is also a social connector. So as an artist, I want to create new representations that make these connections more visible. And so performing infrastructure is a workshop/performance in which people make a human diagram of New York City's drinking water system based on the city's map. So this is this. Can't you see it? You can see it when you're in it. The human diagram visualizes the physical connection between all of the parts of the water system, but it also viscerally illustrates how water is a social connector and that there are human relationships embodied in the infrastructural landscape. Torontonians, you might recognize a few people in this picture. So each participant wears a costume or holds a prop, so it's a little watershed cosplay, so that they become one element in the system, so a reservoir, an aqueduct, a mountain, a water treatment plant, a water tunnel, or a faucet. And they form the connections between the parts of the system with their arms and hands. And after the diagram is in place, they create sort of an infrastructure orchestra in which they vocalize the water flowing through the system. So I have a video of this. It sounds a little subtle, so yeah. So now you can see the map a little bit better as a map. Okay, so this project is goofy. It doesn't really show up here, but you know, people are wearing silly hats, they're wearing weird neckwear, they're holding hands, they're giggling. It's very feel good. But it's also very effective. So one of the reasons that New York City's water system is sustainable into the future is not just the enormity of the physical infrastructure, it's the strength of the agreement or of the cooperation between the Catskills and the city. And so it's important that more people understand this and even model it. So making infrastructure and its underlying policy-driven relationships more touchy-feely, more connected, more rooted in place, and creating a more embodied geography seems very relevant, especially in this political moment. So, thanks.
Can I do this? I need to swap up the view again before we do this. We're going to try to do this together, so hopefully it's works. The choreography works. Go ahead. And can you hear me okay? Yep. And Sandra, do you want to just say?
Testing.
Okay. So thanks very much. I'm Gwen MacGregor. This is Sandra Rechico. Sandra's doing the slides, so I'm going to.
Oh, okay.
So you want to just go forward, yeah. So this is our first time in this city, and we, as mentioned, we've been here for about 10 days, and so we have been walking around and Ubering around, as people do. But something that we have noticed in this city compared to Toronto is not so many people walking in this city, but that's something that we have been doing in the last over a week. And last Sunday, we both were walking, and one of the things I like to do in a place I've never been before is to just kind of wander and not have a particular place that I'm going or a reason, but just to kind of let the place kind of guide me a little bit. And so last Sunday, I found myself following the waterways of this city and down the Providence River, under the highway, down to Fox and India Point, and then I went along and followed up again another river, the Seekonk River, back up into where I was staying. And I found it really helped me get a sense of the land, a feeling of the waterways, that have shaped this city and also the river valleys. I found that really helpful. And while I was doing that, I came across this mural that anyone who lives here, I'm sure, is very familiar with, but I hadn't seen before, and I stopped and looked at it for a while. And one of the things that I really thought about it was when I was looking at it was when giving an acknowledgement, which we have heard here today, that it's important not only to acknowledge the histories, the land, the indigenous peoples, and the enslaved peoples that worked on the Brown University, but also to be thinking about it in the present and in the future. And in Canada, we talk a lot about reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and the rest of us in the country, and it's something that we are working on and taking very seriously. But something I also started thinking about was that both in Canada and here, we can't really begin to have reconciliation until we have justice and retribution for both Indigenous peoples, Native Americans, African Americans, and people of color. And so I really appreciated this this mural in this city helping me think about that in terms of my own commitment to that in the present and moving forward. So I just wanted to share that.
And we'd also like to thank Marissa Brown for the invitation to the conference and to exhibit the project that we have here and her hard work to connect us to so many community partners in Providence. So we're going to talk about that project that's currently at the Carriage House Gallery. But before we go any further into that, we wanted to first give a bit of background as to how this fits into our larger collaborative practice. And we're both based in Toronto. We both have individual artistic practices alongside the collaborative stuff. So I think that we will show kind of how we ended up getting together. And a number of years ago when we started to work together, is this going to work? Yeah. I was documenting where I went during the month of May, and I'd been doing that every year starting in, I think, 2003. Then what I would do is I'd create an acetate, old school, that I put on an overhead projector to trace on the wall where the map. And the scale of the map was determined by the scale of the wall, basically. And what it meant was that repeated trips could end up in different locations on the wall because of the gesture of my mark on the acetate. And I based my trips, like my memory was in a notebook. So I'd say I went north on Dufferin, I turned west on Dundas, I went here and here. And so you'll find, I found that different gestures end up on the wall, and then I put pins, there's color-coded pins to mark destinations. And I wouldn't tell people what the legend was. So if you were from Toronto, you'd probably figure it out a little bit. Some of my friends were like, I'm sure you must have visited my house that week or whatever. And but you know, it was something that was very specific to people that knew the city of Toronto. And the works were temporary, paralleling the ephemeral nature of traveling through the city, because made with tape, they get ripped off the wall, and so they disappear, or they actually transform into something else once the show is over. And so that transformative quality, oh, you don't see anything there?
So while Sandra was working on that, you're just about to see her.
The top of
The
my
top.
partner's head,
Head
yeah.
there. While Sandra was working on those drawings, I had begun working with a GPS, which at the time had been a new technology for, consumer. I had been invited to do a residency in New York City, and I knew I was going to be there for 5 months, and I was thinking about, you might have to hit it again to get it going. There we go. I was thinking about reading Paul Auster at the time and his New York trilogy, and I was thinking about New York as a walking city and trying to come up with a project that would work in New York. So I started carrying a GPS with me everywhere I went. And I actually did that for a number of years, and I ended up, later I stopped doing that for lots of reasons that we came up earlier in terms of privacy and all sorts of issues that have since become an issue. But at the time, it seemed like an interesting thing to do. So what you're seeing here is New York, drawn and then faded every day for 3 months, and then Toronto. And I'll let you figure out which city is which. While both of our processes and artistic outcomes were quite different, we shared an interest in what happened when recorded data is transformed into another artistic medium and the effect it had on that data. And here you can see a detail of Sandra's notebook on the left, and on the right is some of my data from my GPS.
And then in 2006, I think, there's a Toronto curator and art historian, Professor Dan Adler, became aware of both of our independent projects and invited us to collaborate for an exhibition at the Gallery Mercer Union in Toronto, which is an artist-run center. And this exhibition is also shown in Montreal, which is what you see here. So we collected data in 4 cities that we transversed in 2007. Montreal, where we were in exhibition together, Munster and Castle, and Toronto. So we have 3 art destination cities. Munster had the sculpture project happening, a big international exhibition. Castle had Documenta, and then the Montreal exhibition and our home city. And so we added, that's our 3rd city. Yep, okay.
So we both continued with our individual strategies of recording, Sandra with a notebook and me with the GPS. And we decided then to choose 4 artistic mediums to create and challenge the boundaries of mapping, questioning what it means to map accurately or so-called objectively. And here what you're seeing is data from Munster that was part of our exhibition, and my GPS is on the left. Sandra's notebooks are on the right, but you may notice that there are kind of couple of very strange numbers on mine, that really huge numbers there on the right, and that was where, for some reason, the altitude just kind of went off the chart, and sometimes, the GPS would not be would not be accurate, even though we might expect the digital data to be the thing that would be accurate. And on the right is Sandra's notebook, but for example, there was a time where she actually wrote down to turn right instead of left, but she could remember it and correct it manually herself later.
This is the representation of Montreal. And what we did here is we recorded the movements that we had in Montreal at the same time. And these sort of show the limitations and strengths between our 2 tracking strategies. The straight red lines on the left are when Gwen was using the subway, so her GPS couldn't triangulate and it would just sort of pop up again. And whereas my use of the pencil and paper could accommodate the kind of underground part of the trip. And this is a map made in silicone. And so what we did was we made a big map on my studio floor and poured the silicone. It was actually quite a laborious process, but then what would happen is that as the map was hung on the wall, it would only be pinned in a certain number of places, allowing gravity to distort the map. And it sort of exaggerates its kind of flaccid character. So the work changes every time it's installed, and it continues to be affected by gravity over the duration of the exhibition. Oh, that's me again. This is called Distance Castle. And for this drawing, we decided to draw the total distance we traveled while in Castle at the same time. So the distances were drawn on sheets of paper. I have 69 kilometers, and Gwen has 81 kilometers. So there are 81 kilometers of lines there. Gwen's is the bottom, mine is the top. And we predetermined the size of each sheet of paper, and that we'd use the same brand of pencil, but nothing else. And so the viewers denied any detailed information about our routes. Because of the way the drawings are made, it demonstrates the relationship to our bodies, like our reach, gestural tendencies. Gwen was working with hers pinned on the wall, and I was working with mine on a table, so that's why mine end up darker probably, and different physical strength. Gwen was also dealing with an injury, so our physical bodies affected the way the graphite looked in the drawings.
For Toronto, we used a more digital approach, and so here we used GIS, and we intentionally picked data sets about the city that were publicly available, but not necessarily obvious ones that people might use. This one, for example, shows where we were in relation to each other, and then the circles were known marijuana grow-ups at the time. At the time, they were illegal, but of course that has changed since Canada now makes some of them legal. This is another one where we plotted the shortest distance between each other at any given time of the day. Through our collaborative art practice, we're able to map our specific movements. For example, the privilege of movement because we are white. Neither of us have to be harassed by police, for example, when we go about our day-to-day activity in public, and don't have to strategize about that. However, as women, we do often employ a range of strategies of movement within the urban environment, especially at night. So the varied material engagement we use in the process of making acknowledges and incorporates the characteristics of each medium, bringing to the fore what it does best. This results in various aesthetic outcomes, but also works as a strategy to challenge mapping conventions. Our experience, both individual and shared, is mapped through process and material. And this kind of strategy relates to some of my academic geographic scholarship around new materialism literature, which acknowledges the political work that art can do through the material process of making, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later.
And so now we're getting into more participatory works. In 2011, we were invited to exhibit at a place called the A-Trans Pavilion in Berlin, Germany. And this brings us to the first iteration of the project that we're exhibiting in the Carriage House Gallery. But first I want to talk a little bit about the space in Berlin and one of the other drawing installations that we made there. So the exhibition space is pretty unusual. As you can see, it's kind of like a big fish tank. And it was a big cement and glass box in the middle of the Hackensche. And it's just off the S-Bahn station in Mitte. And it's a heritage site consisting of 8 connecting rear courtyards, formerly in East Berlin and restored in 1997. There are lots of shops in this Hof, and it receives a large number of passers-by, both Berliners and visitors. And that fishbowl effect of working in this space in relation to the public, we sort of wanted to, work with that. We found ourselves in the space and respond to it as you might in a new space. So one of the works we made is called Saturday, and we collected data on Saturday, August 6th, and this is not hard data at all. We asked passers-by what time they left the house, and we noted what time they arrived at the pavilion, and then we asked them how far they thought they'd traveled that day. And this became the basis for the installation drawing on the wall, sort of a 3D graph. And we marked on the wall the time of day that they would have left the house, and then on the floor on the right there's time markers. They're kind of hard to see. And the thread reflected the distance traveled. Is this?
Hit it again, so it'll right there. Okay.
So this shows how we installed the piece and the kind of performative nature of working in that space with people passing by all the time, people looking in but not coming in. And so it's a combination of our interpretation of the data collected, and what had happened is the participants, when they told us the distance they traveled and what time they left the house, we asked them which color of thread they wanted, and that's how that was determined. So we had no way of determining that. And you'll probably notice there's a really thick one there. That's a really interesting, that's a pretty interesting story, which we might get to if we have time.
Because of the nature of the space, we began to consider a new project interacting with visitors in another way. It was the beginning of Map It Out, and it took place before the final installation as a kind of a bit of an experiment. So from July 30th until August 13th, we set up a workshop in the space from 1 to 6 p.m. Tuesday to Saturday, where we asked people who came in to share information about their movements that day. At the end of the workshop period, then the space was turned into the exhibition space. People responded enthusiastically, and the project took on a life of its own, with visitors staying, sharing information, having conversations. Interestingly, even though we were in a prime tourist and shopping area of Berlin, we weren't asked what we were selling. In fact, there seemed to be an enthusiasm by the public to engage with something other than shopping. We intentionally didn't ask anyone to draw, but asked if they would like to make a map. Often drawing can be intimidating for some people, whereas a map is a different kind of shared language and something we do in different ways all the time. Some drew the map quite quickly, where others settled in and spent time and effort to respond. It's running.
Mhm.
Okay. Map It Out highlights that project speaks to the importance of the artistic process. This is a really good example of work that art does best compared to other disciplines, as decisions can be made in the moment that respond to people and the environment. We did not have a specific outcome, but that wasn't the point, and we didn't worry about that in the moment. What mattered was to go with what was happening and encourage the enthusiasm that the project clearly generated. Something to note is that since this first iteration, we no longer provide maps to the participants to consult, and that was very funny when we were working with the planners here in this city, because they came in and they said, "What, no baseline map?" And we were like, "It should be in your head." But anyway, that way the Cartesian map conventions are not privileged and give the participants more permission to be more personal or conceptual.
The results were incredibly varied and quite beautiful, and we do have a table of a selection of the maps from Berlin in the exhibition, and some of these will be there.
What started to emerge, or we started to see, were visual shorthands, iconic architecture or infrastructure of the city that could be used as a kind of indexical way of communicating where they had been. For Berlin, two main ones were the television tower in Alexanderplatz, and go to the next one, and the S-Bahn was also a common shorthand.
And you remember that thicker red section? Well, this was a young landscape architect who kind of visited us in the pavilion almost every day. And then he said, well, what if on the last day I just ride the S-Bahn around and around and around starting at 6 a.m.? And I said, well, then we'd have to map it. So we did, except that they had construction going on, so you had to get off and get back on and go the other way, get off, get back on, go the other way. So this is his rendition of what he did. And I really like the idea that that's a sort of collaboration with him, like he inserted his performance into our piece. And that's a really nice thing. In 2013, we were invited to participate in Artist Walks, The Persistence of Peripateticism in the Dorsky Gallery in Long Island City, New York. It was curated by Earl Miller, and we were specifically asked to stage the mapping project again the way we had in Berlin. So our work is on the left, the two walls, and so we put up some of the Berlin drawings, and then we collected new ones in Long Island City. And we decided to get costumes. And
the Dorsky Gallery arranged for us to set up in two locations outside the gallery, and we participated in First Friday at the Noguchi Museum, and this happens once a month where the gallery stays open late, and there are specific events programmed for that evening. We also set up on Saturday at the Socrates Sculpture Park, and once again we asked passersby the same question, how did you get here today? And then the third location was in the gallery itself at the opening of the exhibition. And in that gallery, we had, because there was enough space, we could actually do it right in the opening. So we put up the Berlin drawings that Sandra mentioned, and then at the opening, as people drew, we added them to the wall. And freakishly, we had exactly the right amount by the end of the opening to make a grid. It was really weird.
I didn't actually see the grid because I had to leave to get on a flight, so I never saw it fully completed. So that was it, but it was tight, yeah. So New York's on the left and Berlin's on the right. And we did find there's interesting things about different cities, that the New Yorkers were more reticent to participate, whereas Berlin, they're all keen to draw. And I don't know if what that says exactly, but it was it's interesting to see the different ways people approach it. And here's some Long Island City maps.
Because a lot of it was done in a gallery, there were definitely artists that came, so we found that there were more conceptual ones in that group. Yeah.
I can call this one out. It's Alison Kobayashi.
Yeah. And because we were in Long Island City then, some of the visual markers were a bit different, and in this case it was the Hudson River seemed to be something that people used as a marker. So the shorthand is a way of mapping that uses a well-known tourist landmark to orient the map, which sometimes can be seen as reducing the city to one or two symbols. And here you see the Liberty Bell as a shorthand for Philadelphia and the train tracks that show them getting to Long Island City. But it also could be seen as an interesting and useful tool for participants because it's as a way of starting to draw. It sort of grounds the map and then gives them freedom to go elsewhere.
Last year, we were tried it in a whole brand new location. We were invited to be part of a session at the Royal Geographical Society annual conference in the UK, and it was in Cardiff. Two researchers, Morag Rose, pictured here from Manchester, and Blake Morris from London, are active members in the Walking Artists Network, and they chaired a series of sessions for the conference called Desire Lines, Dawdles, and Drifts. And unlike other conference sessions, nobody was sitting in a room. The series was all activated by walks or activities. And being at this conference offered us access to a new and very specific audience of mostly geographers. And interestingly, it took more encouragement to get people to participate, and we did get asked for directions a lot. I guess we looked like, maybe, I think people interpreted Map It Out as we are going to tell you where your room is. Quite honestly, that happened.
We wondered about this reluctance to participate and if it came from the fact that it was geographers' specific disciplinary relationship to maps. Another quite different consideration is that some geographers have, they have an investment in Cartesian mapping, and it could be less inclined to participate in a personal mapping experience, but that's our conjecture. This one certainly has a clear influence from geography with the inclusion of the map projection. We didn't direct people in terms of scale, so some chose local movements, but some picked a much larger scale.
And in Cardiff, the most prominent visual shorthand or architectural feature used was the Cardiff Castle. So here's a few with the castle. I think this might have been Morag's, I can't remember. And it wasn't unusual for someone who said they couldn't draw to make a really expressive drawing. And that little warning was turned out to be really true.
It's a bad alley.
It was a really bad spot.
We were approached by a geographer from Lima at that conference who is interested in presenting and extending the project in Lima. And this is an interesting possibility that has us considering how the collaboration can evolve and shift outside the Western and global North perspective. It also lends itself well to adding collaborators to the project.
And we're getting this nod from Susan, so we'll just move through. This is some of the Providence locations and showing people
Planners and donuts.
planners, bribes, right? And I don't think we can go there.
Okay. So, just go back just to the conclusion. Okay. To conclude, all of our collaborative pieces work across disciplines and languages of mapping and drawing, thinking of the map as a drawing and drawing as a map. At the foreground is the process of making, allowing materials to do what they do best. It's a very effective way to challenge mapping conventions, open up possibilities of thinking about mapping differently and personally. There's an accepted mapping language that is steeped in colonialism, and our project tries to push back against those assumptions that work to assert some experiences and negate others. Let me just go to the last one. Great, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? Anybody need a stretch break? Yeah, stretch. Let's take like 30 seconds to stretch. Super. It's important, right? Gotta stay present. Here we all are together. I'm so glad to be here today. I've just been really enthralled by all of the presentations, and I was just so delighted when Marissa reached out to me to be a part of this fantastic conference. So my name's Elisa Hamilton. I'm a socially engaged multimedia artist. So I have a BFA in painting and an MA in civic media. And the work that I do really incorporates painting, drawing, performance, theater, music, which are all the things that I have a background in. And when folks are like, well, what does that actually mean that you do? The way I think of my work is that I create spaces that bring people together in a shared experience, in hopefully an experience that sparks a little bit of joy and connection. And I hope that the spaces that I create are spaces of possibility. So something happens there in those spaces that would not have been possible otherwise. So the project that I'm going to share with you today is called Sound Lab. And in my view, as a community-focused artist, maps are about relationships, and they're as much about spatial relationships as they are about our relationships to one another, and the spaces that we inhabit together, and how we understand, interact, and are part of those spaces together as a community. So this project, Sound Lab, the final culmination took place at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in March of 2017. It was part of a contemporary sound exhibition called Listen Here, The Art of Sound. And I worked on Sound Lab for like a year and a half. That culmination was super exciting that 1 week, but the project was really about the process just as much as that final installation. So I'd like to share that process with you before we get into what I actually made. So in the beginning, there were a few elements. There was the map, there was sound, there was the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and there were the community groups. And Sound Lab was about creating a way of understanding a neighborhood and a city beyond the visual. So it used audio, visual, tactile, and experimental elements to create new ways of discovering, exploring, and understanding our Boston communities. So I'm just gonna go through the community partners, and I encourage you to check out all of these organizations. All of them have an online presence except for the drama club. So there's Roxbury Youth Orchestra, and David France is the director of that. And if you Google him online, you can read all about his work and his various projects, including Roxbury Youth Orchestra. There's Mike, which are musicians in community. They're a youth music ensemble that's part of Hyde Square Task Force, which is a larger organization, which is located in the Latin Quarter of Jamaica Plain. There was the Drama Club at Edward M. Kennedy Academy for Health Careers, which is a public high school in Mission Hill. And there's Eiley Live, which is hosted by Nina Lanegra, who's an artist and community organizer. And that took place at Haley House Bakery Cafe, which is a great community spot, which I think is just reopening. That performance series has been retired for now, but you can still find Nina online. She did that performance series for 14 years. I really like to begin all of my community-focused projects by showing up and listening. And that was especially important with this project, which was a sound project. So this is Mike, Hyde Square Task Force. So the community partners, I worked with Ria Vedro, the Director of Community Engagement at the Gardner Museum, to identify the community groups. And we talked a little bit about, what community groups would be a great fit to bring onto the project. And the idea was that these would all be walkable. All the organizations would be walkable from the museum, so within 2 miles of the museum, with the hope of creating these authentic paths to and from the museum by way of creating these really true, meaningful relationships, which is why this was a long-term project. 3 out of 4 of the organizations were teen groups. And so before our first meeting, so Ria and I actually met with the organizers, the facilitators of each group, just to chat with them and learn about them and tell them about us and sort of gauge their interest in the project. And once we had, developed that level of trust, then we moved on to the planning process. So the first workshops took place on site at the community organization's location. And I asked all of the teens to actually record sounds from their ordinary lives to bring to that first session. So the first thing that we did as a group was listen to all these sounds that they'd collected from their ordinary lives and really do close listening together, because this project was really about listening together, not listening with headphones like we usually do, one track at a time. It was about listening, close listening together. So some of the sound clips that students brought were waiting for the bus, at the supermarket. One student brought in a clip of her playing with her baby sister. Another student brought in a recording of them at a Latin American restaurant, which she spoke about. Her family's from Honduras. And so she was excited to share a little bit of folks speaking her native language, and you could hear the warmth of the clatter of the dishes and the family interacting. So we're all thinking about sort of like what stories are we telling with this audio and these unselective recordings. And this is Nina La Negra at Haley House Bakery Cafe during her performance series. And this community group was a little bit different because these recordings that I made of Haley House Bakery Cafe and Nina were really community conversations. So as the process went on, I started recording just what was happening, the individual groups doing what they do best. So this is the drama club at Edward M. Kennedy for Health Careers. So that's their facilitator, Laura Boston, on the left, who I continued to collaborate on with other projects. And here are some of the students. I recorded them reading monologues that they had created. And here's Roxbury Youth Orchestra, and you could see David France with his students in the cafeteria that they practice in Roxbury. And so, as I said, it was really important that we start by traveling to these community groups where they were. And then the next step was to invite these community groups to the museum and have them start to feel at home in the museum and have them start to understand that this was a place for them. And so this is Roxbury Youth Orchestra in Calderwood Hall, where the installation actually ended up being. I should say at the beginning of the project, we really didn't know it was what was going to be made, and the community partners were so generous to come onto this project not knowing exactly what would be created. They just knew it was a sound project and that that my intention was to really feature them. And so here I am recording. And I didn't, as I said, I didn't know what form the audio would take. I'm a lover of things that are tactile. If you can touch and hold something, then you can physically share it with somebody else. And once you've shared something with somebody else, then you have actually the beginning of a relationship. You've actually given something to somebody else. So I'm a really big fan of analog technology for that reason. And I'm also a fan of sort of combining, acknowledging, the possibilities of digital technology, collaborating with analog technology. So records turned out to be the medium that I wanted to use for this project. And as we had gathered around in the beginning to listen to the young people's sounds, I gathered records from all different eras, 78s, 45s, LPs, and students, I don't think any of them had ever played a record before. So that was that was actually kind of amazing because there was this sense of wonderment about this technology to them. And it ended up being this really wonderful thing where we all gathered around. Here we are, Purple Rain, obviously. We all gathered around this record player in the cafeteria, and each student played a record. And, I had these old 78s from the 40s, the Andrews sisters. And so we listened to these records together closely and started the way we had sort of dissected their own recordings, started to think about, well, what can you tell about this time? When do you think folks might have listened to this record? Do you think they would have listened to this record in their home? Do you think they would have listened to this record, as a group, alone? What was the purpose of this? And what can we learn from this? That spurred art making in the round, which actually was a really delightful thing to do with everyone. And, as an artist, I have the pleasure of making things all the time. And so bringing these art materials into a space where these students are usually making music was actually really exciting to everybody because many of their school systems didn't actually have art making anymore. And so the workshop where we did this, I said to the facilitator, it was like we'd finished sort of recording a little bit earlier, and I was like, do you think that, an hour of art making is going to be like boring? And he was like, no. And he was right. It was just, so I asked them, the prompt that I gave them was to make a record that embodies your identity, that embodies you, who you are. And so these are the records that they made. So I ended up ultimately making a record collection for each community group. This is a picture disc that you can see the track. This is the track right here. And I made these custom record jackets. So each community group ended up with this archive of their own sounds. And I brought some of these records here today, so I'll put them out during the coffee break if folks want to touch and hold them. I did not bring a record player. However, I did bring one of the tracks to play for you today. So this is one of the tracks.
Okay, ready, and look at each other, look across the room, look across the room. Chase, stop stopping yourself. And yes, Axel. Cue every note. Cue with me and cue. Yeah, Tiffany. Don't rush me though.
So that was Mr. Kids playing with his students. And you can hear, this is a rehearsal. This is not a perfect recording. This is not like a performance that they're doing. This is just this group doing what they do together. And, we see in the image on the record that this is the space that they practice in. The turntables for the installation, this is Nina LaNegra being her fabulous self. I had these turntables, they were locally made at a company in Woburn called U-Turn Audio. It was really important, I felt, for the design of this space to really be beautiful and engaging. And when a visitor walked in, it beckons them to interact with the installation. So you can see here, this is the installation in Calderwood Hall, and this is actually a map that I made as the physical foundation for the installation. So this originally was a work on paper, a multimedia work on paper. It was like this big. I had it photographed at very, very high resolution and turned into this 20-foot by 20-foot map that physically embodies the locations of the community groups. So folks who might know Boston, that orange line that's traveling down the middle, that's the orange line on the subway, and the green line's over here. I used, the city of Boston has a bunch of street maps that I used as a guide, and I freehand drew the map because I wanted it to have, the same sort of handmade sort of vibrance that I experienced when working with these community organizations, this authentic nature to it. So each community group has their own listening station, and you can see there that people are gathering around and listening. This was actually kind of a quiet day. This was taken on a Wednesday. But what's really cool about this space is the way it ebbed and flowed, because it was by design that there weren't any barriers in between the listening stations. Originally the museum was kind of like, are you sure you want to let people, play the records? Like, what if something breaks? What if something happens? What if the music's too loud? And I was just like, let's just let people figure it out. And they did. Nothing broke. Okay, one thing broke, but I had it was like the same night I had the maker of the turntables come and give a talk. So he just came and fixed it. So it was like perfect. And I think also for U-Turn, they were like, oh, wow, these are really durable. So nothing broke. Folks gathered around the turntables like campfires. So people were listening together. They were, again, exchanging these records in addition to the archive of picture discs for each community organization. I wanted to provide also like a broader context for the sounds historically that it existed in the Boston area through vinyl. So I did this deep dive of vintage vinyl and included records from Donna Summer and New Edition, folks that I had known about, and then also created my own paths throughout the neighborhood, visiting local record stores and learning about Boston's musical history. And I found some great 45s from a store called Skippy White's, apparently, which he used to have his own record label. So we ended up not doing 45s for the whole duration of the project because you have to manually change the speed of the record player, which actually was super complicated. But yeah, so you can see folks gathering around, and it was really important for me that this project was really a celebration of these community organizations, and also provided a platform for folks to gain awareness about and visibility for these community organizations. And I should also mention that museum arranged for anybody who was there to see Sound Lab to come for free. So folks just had to come and say Sound Lab, and it was free. So all the community organizations could invite their folks and invite anybody who they wanted. So there was really about lowering the barriers to participate and engage, and really allow people to feel like this was a place for them. And then there was this really wonderful intergenerational learning thing that started to happen, because these young people would come in, again, never having seen a record before, never having played the record before, and then older folks would come in and be like, oh, I have this great record player, let me show you how to use this. And so that became like a really wonderful opportunity for sharing experiences. And also a really wonderful opportunity to, again, educate about our neighborhood, educate about the community groups that are doing wonderful work in our neighborhood. This is a group of students from the museum school. And so, they're coming to school here in Boston without necessarily this context of the other really wonderful things that are happening. And so it was a great way to share with them that. And again, celebrating the community groups. So this is the drama club holding all of the records that have their sounds and images on them. And we also invited these community groups into the museum to perform in the museum during the run of Sound Lab. So again, celebrating their work and allowing the community to engage in what it is that they're doing. And then I'll start to move a little faster. There's Nina bringing her performance series, bringing these community conversations into the museum. And then every day of Sound Lab, I hosted an open mic. So visitors to the museum were invited to add their own voices to the Sound Lab. So each day had a theme that folks would learn about when they came into the museum, and I would get up there with a mic and say, okay, who wants to say a thing? What are people thinking about? And so it was an opportunity, again, for everybody to be a part of the Sound Lab. This young woman got up and sang a song. Those are my parents. And so in closing, I just want to say that by engaging in multimedia map making, that are tactile and playful and experiential, we can really develop accessible projects that everybody can participate in and understand, and deepen our understanding of our neighborhoods, our communities, and each other. Thank you.
And we'll take a few minutes for questions. I think Connor has a mic. If anybody has a question, we can get started with the questions while people are sitting down. Just raise your hand if you have a question. There's one. Okay, you as you like. Thank you, guys. So I said questions and I lied. This was just wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your work. We appreciate it deeply. Now let's have some questions.
Thank you all so much for your presentations. I was really curious about, like, as artists, it seems like it's a very process-based thing, and like there are specific kind of end things, such as this exhibition that happened. But like, I think as you mentioned specifically, like it was really about the process. So I was curious about how you think about documenting that. So for example, in this presentation, there were like photos and obviously like the records that came out of it. But like, I guess I'm wondering how you kind of figure out, like, there are so many like things that are like intangible and you can't really capture. So like, how do you think about like remembering it, and like who is that remembrance or archive kind of for?
That actually ties in directly with something that I forgot to say, which is that after this project was over, all of these pieces of the project were gifted to the community partners. So the record players, the archives, the speakers, all of this was gifted to each community partner so that they would have that documentation, so that they would have that archive. So in the case of this project, that went to them. And so I have audio tracks, I have images, but the physical remnants of that project belong with the community, and that's where they are.
We take photographs, of course, and then the images, the drawings that are made are all scanned. So we're looking at the possibility in the future of a publication of some kind. And also we're looking at the idea of, well, because we work with Dorcas International Institute, and maybe incorporating a sense of stories somehow into it, that you might want to talk about a bit more.
Well, in that particular case, this was the first time we were in a classroom setting rather than just being set up somewhere publicly where we were just kind of going, hey, come by. So we went to a class, but we felt in that circumstance, we needed something also maybe like slower time, like not this sort of quicker time thing. And so we're just thinking about that and how the teachers are really interested in a longer term relationship. So maybe something that we can go back to them and say, hey, what do you want to do with the maps? We did these maps, but now what? Like, what would you like to do? So that's something. But another point I think about these kind of practices that I think is really important is actually in many ways, increasingly I feel as an artist, the important stuff isn't actually in the gallery, it isn't in the drawings, it's actually the ephemeral stuff, the interaction that can't be captured. And I think there's something really important about that not everything can be quantified, and that the experience that we've had over the last 10 days and with all the interactions with all the people and the kids and all that stuff, it was in that moment and in that sharing in that moment. And that's what it is, that's what it's supposed to be, and you can't capture it. And that's, I think, in these times that we live in, for lots of really important political reasons, it's really important that they actually can't be captured other than in the moment.
Connor, I think Joanna had a question and then one over here.
Hi, thanks everyone for sharing. I think a couple of you talked about how in the beginning of your project you didn't really know what the ultimate outcome of it would be. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about in engaging with the public and with community groups or other collaborators, or even like with an institution like the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, like how do you pitch your ideas to them and frame your idea and build trust with those folks, so it's like something that that they want to participate in and ultimately like believe in, you know?
So I mean, obviously, it's dependent on the project. I think for me, the way that I work, typically there's something that's an anchoring situation that starts the project. So I know it's located in a particular place, or I know that a particular person is commissioning it, or an institution is commissioning it. And you sort of start from there. And I almost don't even. It's like I always say, like it's like if someone offered me like a white box gallery space to do something in, like a space that's kind of designed to theoretically have no context. Like I just wouldn't have any, I wouldn't have any ideas of what to do there. I think there always has to be some sort of initial seed, and then from there you kind of figure out, who your collaborators are, what the situation might afford or need, and you kind of are. It's just like this process of kind of following the threads of whatever's there. I think that in some of the work that I showed, there is a particular situation I think all of us, maybe to some extent, encounter, which is that the person who's paying for the project isn't necessarily the person that like it's for, and a lot of times, even though you have some sort of commissioning institution, you still sort of, that's not really enough to like, oh well, I want to please this random gallery or like a museum. You have to figure out who's your real constituency, and I think for me that often is like almost half of the time spent on the project is figuring out like what is your, I'm curious about sort of the process of how you found those 4 groups. Was that assigned, or did you choose them for specific reasons? But that to me is like a really big part of this kind of project, is figuring out who are your collaborators, and then in some ways it unfolds from there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is a really slow project. So I've gotten to know people slowly, and when I don't live in the Catskills. I mean, I'm connected to them because I drink the water. So when I started going up there and talking to people, I was really clear that I was like, I'm an outsider, and I'm just researching, and I want to do something, but I want it to be helpful to you. Like, I was very clear about that from the beginning, and I sort of had an idea that I wanted to do a tour, and I was already starting the workshop. So I had these sort of like things that I could like point to, but that weren't very concrete. And I just kept showing up, and in the Catskills, I met one person who was like, oh, you need, like, I hired a wilderness guide for a day to take me around to places, like to get a permit and go like walk around the reservoirs and things like that, because I'm really uncomfortable hiking on my own, especially off trails. So I hired somebody to come with me, and he was like, oh, you need to meet my parents. And his parents were like super connected and lovely people, and they like, I go visit them, and they like, I make sure that I don't eat lunch, because if Nancy doesn't get to feed me lunch, she's going to be pissed. And they introduced me to Diane, who's the historian, and like, so it's like this chain, like when you get into a community, this is what happens. But for me, because I'm from the outside and I'm really aware of it, it's a very slow process for me. So, and I think, it's been 4 years, and I think that some people do trust me now, which is really nice. And so that allows me to like think about the next stage, like what can happen with these tours, what can happen with a workshop, what are other things I want to do, and who might want to get involved in them, and how could it be mutually beneficial, right? Or actually less beneficial to me, I can do that easily, right? But how is it beneficial to them, to the Catskills, to the organization, et cetera, et cetera? So that's always in my mind.
Go for it. Yeah, I earlier today, after the keynote presentation, I think we talked a little bit about humility and this idea of entering community with humility. And a friend of mine has an expression, it's the speed of trust. And any project just moves at the speed of trust, and that's going to vary depending on the community. It usually takes time, and that's true with institutions also, is that you really need to trust each other, and then also set this expectation whatever it is, what is the timeline we think here, and like what are the parameters, and I don't know what I'm gonna make, but I got a plan to make it, that kind of thing.
One more. This over here.
Hi. Oops, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I really enjoyed all of the presentations, and I just wanted to thank you for that. I teach critical theory at Bryant University, and it was giving me a lot of ideas, like what are some things I could try with students, or what could we try even with the larger student body? And one of the moments that struck me was when Rosten Wu was talking about that survey, what is it, the visitor survey, and the way the students would complain that they didn't fit. Like that's a really great moment. And I was wondering if that survey were available online or something to look at. It's just sort of interesting to think about what categories are we given, how are we seen by different institutions, and how do we fit or not fit into those categories?
So the basic answer is yes, you can download it from my website. Every project I showed, you can download all of it from the website. I think it's kind of a decision as somebody makes this kind of work to make it available for free in some form to anyone who wants it. So it's all there. And I just want to maybe segue that back to you and and maybe that first question of I think in talking about how does a project work or how does you document it, it's kind of an interesting, I think most of the things I make, I kind of think of it's about creating a situation, and it's supposed to work in a particular avenue, and the documentation of it either happens or doesn't, it doesn't really matter. But there is also something I always feel, a glimmer of regret that a lot of the works, I didn't really show them, but a lot of the works I've done are digital, and then they kind of disappear just through upgrades to technology. This browser doesn't work anymore, blah, blah, blah. And there's something really wonderful, I think, about records in particular, in that kind of archival sense of leaving some sort of thing the technology is simple enough that anyone will be able to kind of use it and decode it decades from now. There's something kind of incredible about being able to leave this physical object. And so different project, I do some things that are permanent installations in a park, or some things that are just have a little moment of, Twitter interest, and then they die. They all have these different kind of I don't know, whatever, tales of discovery. And so some of them, you kind of launch it and no one cares at all, and you have this hope that well, maybe in 15 years someone might find this sign and care about it, or it might mean something to them. And I think that's sort of an interesting thing about thing making in general, is that an object travels to places that you don't necessarily expect it to or intend it to.
Marissa says the coffee's late, so we have time for another question. I saw somebody over here. How about over there? Oh, sure. You go first. And then there's one over here.
So my question is if people could articulate how they think about the value of the project to the community they're working in. I mean, we've sort of done it a little bit before, but if there's a way that you approach a project with a community when you think about what's in it for them, and what they might gain from it.
I just spoke.
I think that I think people have spoken a bit about that before in terms of get the community in it. I think earlier somebody said it was the access to the research or things like that. And I think for us, it's about engaging with those people, like Gwen was saying, that moment where you sit down to do this thing, and a lot of people are like, I can't draw, and then they make these amazing things and sit there for 20 minutes. And so it's giving, I think there's that exchange of kind of a gesture of generosity on both sides, and then to talk to people about, well, what is that? What are you showing me here? And they get to tell their stories. There was one of the students at Dorcas who drew a picture of a house by a river, and there's the sun. And then he said, "Oh, this is my home in Syria." And then he brought out his phone and showed us the bombed house in Syria. And so there's those kind of exchanges of information that are they're not measurable, like Gwen said, not quantifiable, that I think are really worthwhile in these types of projects.
One more question back here. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have something you were going to say? I'm sorry.
Well, were we going to I don't know. Well, yeah, I'll just add something. I mean, I think I really loved what one of the speakers on the last panel sort of said, and their kind of ethos of research was like, we don't even approach people unless we have something to offer them. And I think that that's really important. I think in a lot of kind of community engagement work and social practice artwork, there's a kind of assumption that like your takeaway is that you got to participate, like, like hooray, like that's, you should be happy to have been part of my project. And I think that that's there's something very extractive about that, especially when it's sort of about a kind of collecting your experience. So I think that to me, when I organize a project like this, I try to make it maybe overly transactional, where it's like, if you participate, you will get this. Like, I will give you a copy of the book, and you will get a photograph, and we will have food for you at this event, and we will pay you an honorarium to do this. So it's, anytime you're asking someone to spend their time working with you, it's like their time is as valuable as my time. And so if I'm getting paid, and there's plenty of projects where I'm not getting paid, in which case I'm like, please participate. But if I'm getting paid, you're getting paid. I think is like a good rule of thumb for this kind of work, and something I try to employ.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I like that idea of like, this is, and again, I think it has to do with expectations, sort of in advance, being like, we're doing this thing, we would, we'd love your participation. Also, we'd like to offer you this honorarium. This is going to be the timeline. Also, we would like to invite you to perform at the museum and, be a part of this, imaginative installation. But yeah, I think that, I love the mutual exchange of generosity. I think that is a great way to put it. And I think that goes back to this idea of trust, where it's like you're starting with that foundational relationship that's the beginning. And then from there, you're deciding together what that collaboration is going to be and how that will, be a success for everybody involved.
I promise one more question, even though the coffee's here. Okay, go ahead, let's have coffee. Oh, good. Marissa, what time do you want us back?
3:45.
3:45?
Maybe if I want an extra 5 since we went late to 3:50.
3:50. Could you join me in thanking these wonderful